counting all of these different types, original remains, the actual animal itself, the imprints like traces or burrows or molds or casts, out of all of those things, we only know about 1 out of every 40,000 different species on Earth. And the problem is, for the first 4 or 3.5 billion years of Earth's history, it was just bacteria. That's it. There was no animals, there was no plants, none of that. And bacteria really don't leave behind fossils. And even when we did have animals and plants, most of those don't have bones. And a lot of the early plants didn't really have hard wood or trunks or anything like that. So not very much of the fossil record remains, or we just haven't discovered it yet. So the field of paleontology is not done with. There are lots of fossils out there that have yet to been discovered. Now, another reason it's so hard to make fossils, not just that the animals are too soft to be preserved or too small to be preserved, is they have to be preserved. So in order to form fossils, we need a couple of different things. First, that organism has to die. Then it has to be protected. So if you have a trilobite right here, it falls to the bottom of the ocean and then it gets eaten, that's it. It's not going to make a fossil. It has to survive and not be eaten by something else. It also can't be eaten by microbes. So if you have a fossil, and even if an animal doesn't come by and eat it, bacteria will come by and digest it. And oxygen is the great destroyer. Now, let's say, okay, it gets protected. It gets buried under some rocks, and it's not being attacked or eaten. Well, that's another problem, because buried under rocks are really heavy. If this animal usually doesn't have hard parts, that's the end. It gets crushed, it gets taken away, maybe it gets squeezed out, no fossils left. Hard parts help. They're not required, but they help, because those bones, shells, and teeth can hold up against the pressure of the rock above them. So it doesn't have to have hard body or hard parts or bones or things like that, but it definitely does help. Now, even if it's protected, it's buried, it's not attacked, it's not eaten, and it's got hard parts, so it's not crushed by the rocks, if that fossil never comes out of the rocks, it just stays underground, we would never know about it. So it's like a tree. If a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, did it happen? Well, the answer to that is yes. If a fossil is made and stays underground, does it matter? The answer to that is no. We don't know about it. If we don't know about it, then it doesn't really matter. There could be 1 billion fossils under the Las Vegas Valley and we wouldn't even know about it. It really doesn't matter. So somebody's got to go and find these things. And most of them are still stuck underground. A very, very few of them make it to the Earth's surface and allow us to find them. So that's why it's a big deal if, you know, a big building is being constructed or a stadium or something like that and they find fossils. They stop construction to make sure they get all the fossils and catalog them before they build the building on top of them. It's kind of a big deal when you find fossils. Now, let's get into the different types of fossils, because they're all different and some are more common than others. One of the more common ones is right here. That is paramineralized. You might also see it called petrified remains. The reason for that is, well, here's petrified wood right here on this picture. And so for petrified wood, what happened? Well, you know, tree trunks are pretty hard. They're made of wood, lignite. And that wood, when it's buried underground, it gets replaced slowly over time. So some of the wood gets replaced with minerals, silicate or silica, SiO2. So if you're talking about bones, the calcium in the bones will be replaced by silica. If you're talking about wood, the wood itself will be replaced by silica. And what you'll notice is this has basically the same shape as the original tree. Look at that. Even the bark is represented. Look at all those lines for the bark. Even the tree rings are preserved. But there is no wood left in this. Not a single ounce of wood anywhere in this tree. It is all rock now. This petrified tree is basically rock. It is rock. It's made of silica now. It's not made of wood anymore. So when you have paramineralized remains, they are now rock. They are not the original organism. You can still tell some things about it. You can tell how old this tree was when it died based on its rings. You can tell that it had bark, but you would not be able to like pull DNA out of this. Now, here's the thing. Underground is very dangerous to fossils. Or I should say underground damages fossils. Acid eats away bones. Acid can eat away the tree bark itself. So if you don't paramineralize really, really old fossils, they will disappear. There are no original remain dinosaur bones. All dinosaur bones have been petrified by silicates or silica, SiO2. So really, really, really old bones and things like that have to be paramineralized or else they won't be there anymore. Now, the next type of fossil we have is carbonaceous films. Now, for carbonaceous films, what is it? Let's say you have an organism that contains carbon. That's every single organism. All organisms contain carbon. And let's say that organism becomes buried, right? It has to be buried so that it's not eaten. You add some heat and pressure, and good news, anything underground is automatically pressurized because the rocks above it will squeeze it, and underground is hot. Now what happens is all the nice juices get squeezed out. So this bee and this leaf here, all of the gases, all the hydrogen and the oxygen and the nitrogen, they all get squeezed out, and what you're left with is just carbon, or a carbon film left over. So all the carbon that was in this leaf is now in this rock. It's just an imprint. You don't know what the bee looked like. You don't know the color of the bee. In fact, you don't even know the three-dimensional shape of the bee. You just know the two-dimensional shape of the bee. And so this process is called carbonization. Carbonaceous films, carbonization, right? Now, there's another process that can make even more carbonization. So instead of a 2D layer, how about a three-dimensional rock completely made out of carbon? Well, we would call that rock coal. So if you take not just one single leaf or one single bee, but you take an entire forest and you put it underground and you squeeze it with more and more and more and more pressure, what will happen is everything but the carbon will be squeezed out. So all the hydrogen will be squeezed out, all the that's not helium, all the nitrogen, and you're left with basically pure carbon. Not pure, but almost pure, like 99% carbon in some cases. So in this case, coal is actually a fossil. What kind of fossil is it? It's a carbonaceous fossil. It's why we call it a fossil fuel, because it came from previous life, from trees in a forest sometime 300, 400 million years ago. Now, there's another type of fossil that doesn't rely on carbon, and that is a mold. So what is a mold? A mold is a cavity in rock that is formed from an organism. Basically, the organism is no longer there, but the shape of the space it took up is there, left in place in the rock itself. So it's kind of like how plastics are made these days. They put them in a mold, and you can fill that mold with something to make a cast. But for now, a mold, imagine this trilobite gets buried underground. The rocks squeeze on top of it. The rocks are below it. Some acid comes through and eats away the trilobite, but the rocks stay in the same spot. And so you have this empty cavity left over in the shape of that trilobite. Now, what could you do to a mold? Well, you can come in and make a cast. So for example, got this one in a second, but what is a cast first? A cast is when sediments fill in a mold and they harden into rock. So it looks a lot like the original. It keeps the same shape as the original, but everything internally is lost. So if there were bones, they're not there anymore. There is no bones in this cast. This cast was actually made by humans in the 1800s. They came in, they were excavating Pompeii, and they kept excavating and finding these empty holes. And they're like, what are these empty holes? Well, they couldn't see it because it was a mold, and it's kind of hard to visualize a mold as you're excavating the ground. So what they did was they actually poured plaster of Paris into the ground, into these empty cavities. And then after the plaster hardened, they came by and pulled out the rest of the dirt, and they're like, oh, these empty cavities were human-shaped. They must have been a mold of a human. And so what happened when they poured that plaster in it is they made of casts. Now, this cast contains nothing. There is no original remains of the human left. There's nothing remaining. It was an empty spot before they filled it in with the plaster. So the only thing that is preserved is the shape. The longer something sits, the less likely a mold is going to be made. And the harder the bodies or bones it has, the more likely a mold is going to be made. Okay, so that's mold and casts. Now let's talk about original remains. Now, original remains are probably the least common type of fossil out there. They are the most rare. And they are the actual organism themselves, or part of the organism that is preserved. So two types of original remains, probably what you're most familiar with, is freezing or preserving in amber. Now, preserving in amber, it can preserve insects and other small organisms for a long period of time. Amber is pretty stable. Freezing, not so much. So anytime like something melts, that's it. If it melts, like if this mammoth wasn't discovered by humans quickly, animals would have come and eaten it, bacteria would have come and eaten it, oxygen would have attacked it. So freezing, yes, it can preserve it for 10,000s of years, but it's not perfect. As soon as that organism gets exposed and unfreezes, that's it. It's going to be starting to be destroyed. So Woolly mammoth, this one was from Siberia. They actually find multiple woolly mammoths from Siberia. This was a pretty well-preserved sample. And the nice thing about original remains is you can tell a lot of things about the organism. You can tell what color it was. You can tell what size it was. You can tell what it ate. So in fact, they've found frozen mammoths where they've cut open their stomach contents and figured out what plants and animals they ate. And finally, you might even be able to extract DNA from a frozen mammoth or frozen anything. So unlike the amber, which after a million years, the DNA is going to break down, well, mammoths only been frozen for about 10 to 15,000 years, maybe even a little bit longer than that. So it is possible that some of the DNA is still around inside that mammoth. And also other things that you wouldn't think of getting preserved, like trunks, they don't contain any bones. Ears don't contain any bones. Hair. So hair is even preserved by freezing, whereas, if it was a mold or a cast, the hair would not be preserved. Now, another example of original remains that you might not have thought of is tar pits. So in California, there's the La Brea tar pits. You could actually have animals and organisms preserved in tar, and you might still be able to preserve some of the other original remains from them. Hair might be able to be preserved, and same for stomach contents. So the problem with tar pits is the tar tends to be, tend to get rid of some of the contents of the mammoth itself. Like there's no eyes or anything like that. So you could almost think of it as a pickled organism at that point, but it still is pretty useful for figuring out, what was living, and it tells you a lot more than other. So the skin is still intact with tar pits, hair is still intact, teeth are still intact, lots is still intact with original remains. Now our last fossil type, the sixth type if you're keeping count, is trace fossils. So for trace fossils, here's the thing. Trace fossils are probably the most common type of fossil. And the reason for that is they're really, really easy to make. Well, okay, a lot of them are made. So even if they're, destroyed very, very easily, there's just so many footprints and burrows out there that some of them are going to be preserved. So what is a trace fossil? A trace fossil is an imprint left in rock or mud by a living animal. So footprints are an easy example. Burrows, nests, tunnels, anything that an animal has pressed into the ground, and that has been preserved by either being covered quickly or maybe a volcano came by and put ash on it, something like that. And so there are a lot of these, a lot of these. These are the easiest things because there's just so many of them. So here's some near Denver, Colorado. There's a whole bunch of fossils, trace fossils, on the eastern edge of Utah and the western edge of Colorado. And you could literally just drive right up on the road. There's a road right here and just look, and there's a whole bunch of trace fossils, hundreds of different dinosaur footprints. So you can imagine that even though, think about it, a footprint, it rains, the footprint's gone. So even though trace fossils are really, really hard to preserve, just think of how many millions of years animals have been walking on the earth. And of those millions of years, how many billions of animals have walked in mud? There's going to be trillions of different footprints. Some of those footprints are going to be preserved. Out of the trillions, there's going to be a lot left over. So that is the case with trace fossils. They tend to be the most common because, well, there's just a lot of footprints going on there and a lot of burrows and a lot of nests and a lot of tunnels. There's just a lot. Okay, that's it for that. Let's start. Okay, so that's index fossils, short period of time, abundant and widespread all over the earth, hopefully. Let's look at some past examples of those. So there's this one, and this one. So that one's for that one. This one's for this one. This one's for this one. And if you look at these three dates, this one lived from 440 million years ago back to 250. This one lived from 505 million years ago back to 410. And this one lived from 440 to 286. And you might be thinking, well, how would this tell us the age of the rock? Well, if that rock contains all three of these, then that rock's age must be between 410 and 440 million years. It can't be older because then there would be no this type in it. It can't be younger than 410 because then there would be no Ilianus in it. So it's got to be this age to contain all three of these types. Now, there is index fossils in Nevada. One example is these crinoids right here. You can find a lot of them in northern Nevada. So there is index fossils. There are a lot of places on Earth. In fact, there are some of these or similar to this one in Mount Charleston as well. Now, let's take a look at not this example. Let's take a look at this example. So fossil A, 250 to 440, fossil B, 410 to 505, and fossil C, 286 to 440. So basically, we're looking at these examples right here. Now, the last thing that fossils can tell you is climate, what it was like. They've found fossils in Antarctica of ferns. Ferns are like tropical plants. You're not going to find those in Antarctica today. So using fossils, we can tell that Antarctica used to be warm. It used to be closer to the equator. We can also find brachiopods, which are shallow, warm water animals, in Mount Charleston. You're not going to find brachiopods in a desert. They only live underwater, first of all. And so you might be thinking, well, that must mean that Mount Charleston must have been underwater at one point. Yes. Yes, it was. So it can tell you about the ocean levels as well with fossils. Now, let's get to our